Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Anatomy at Keuka College. In this video, we're going to talk about the cerebrum, and this video is a continuation of our lecture series on Chapter 13, the central nervous system. In this video, we're not going to go through each and every page or structure in the cerebrum. That would be a very, very long lecture and probably would be an entire semester in itself. So here we're just going to highlight some major structures and some major functions of the different lobes of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is actually the most rostral part of the brain, and so this is going to be the one that is closest to the nose. And it is going to be the largest part of the brain. It composes about 83% of the brain's mass. And many times people actually confuse the cerebrum with the brain itself. Note that the cerebrum is only a portion of the brain, and there are many other structures that help compose the brain, and those have very important functions as well. The cerebrum is going to have many functions, and these functions are going to be localized to specific regions of the cerebrum. So different parts of the cerebrum are going to be responsible for different things. One of the ways that researchers actually study the brain to figure out the cerebrum's major functions is going to be functional fMRIs. So functional MRIs or fMRIs. fMRIs look at the flow of blood through the brain, and regions that are more active is going to have a higher blood flow. So researchers can ask participants to be in an fMRI and perform specific functions, and they can look at what regions of the brain increase their blood flow and therefore kind of light up on the diagram. So first, what I'd like to do is kind of look at the function of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is going to be composed of two hemispheres. There is the left cerebellar hemisphere and the right cerebellar hemisphere. Left cerebral hemisphere and right cerebral hemisphere. My mistake. Right down the middle, we're going to have a separation called a fissure. Deep grooves that separate different regions of the brain are called fissures. So they're like a crack that separates it. And this groove or this fissure is going to go deep in between the brain and go down to a structure called the, why isn't it? Oh, I forget. I'll tell you guys later in lab. My brain is not working at the moment. Ironic, huh? So it's going to go deep into the brain. There is a second fissure. The second fissure is going to be the transverse cerebral fissure. It separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So it's another deep groove. We can see the brain has a lot of folds in it. These folds, as we learned, allows the brain to fit into the small space of the skull. And it also increases the surface area of the gray matter, so the brain has more processing power than it would have if the brain was smooth. Other organisms do have smooth brains. Mice and koalas and things like that do have smooth brains, so not all organisms is going to have a brain that is so folded. The shallow grooves over here are going to be called sulci. Or if we're talking about just an individual one, it's called a sulcus, yay for Latin. And these mountainous regions are going to be called gyri or gyrus if we're talking singular. The cerebrum is divided into 5 lobes. 4 of them are superficial and 1 is deep. On this diagram, you can see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and then temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is separated from the other lobes using the lateral sulcus. Note that these lobes get their names because they are named after the bone that they lie under. There's another important sulcus that I would like to discuss. This is the central sulcus. And the central sulcus is going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And on either side of the central sulcus, we have two very important gyri. This is the precentral gyrus that's going to be part of the frontal lobe. And this is actually going to contain the primary motor cortex. And over here, we have the postcentral gyrus. This is going to contain the primary somatosensory cortex. We'll talk about these cortexes in a little bit more detail in this video. And I do want to be able to discuss these more in detail because they're going to be important for when we talk about ascending and descending pathways through the spinal cord. Here, what we have done is we've taken a small section of the brain and removed it. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing the gray matter and the white matter. In the brain, the gray matter is going to be superficial, while the white matter is going to be deep. This will be flipped in the spinal cord, as we'll see in our upcoming videos. The gray matter is going to be composed of cell bodies and unmyelinated axons, so we'll have a lot of interneurons. And the gray matter is going to be really important because there's a lot of synapsing that is going to occur here. And so the gray matter is going to be responsible for integrating information and processing information that comes into our brain and determining the correct motor or emotional responses to those stimuli. The white matter, on the other hand, is going to be more deep. The white matter is going to be composed of myelinated axons, and they will be bundled together in structures called tracts. The tracts will connect different regions of the brain, so different regions of the same hemisphere, other regions crossing over the hemisphere, and different regions of the brain like the cerebrum and the pons and so on and so forth. It will also connect the spinal cord, and the spinal cord will help connect the brain to the peripheral nervous system. So this is really important so that the brain has a capability of communicating with other regions of the brain and creating pathways that are going to lead to coordinated responses to the stimuli that we experience. Over here, we're actually seeing a real brain, so my apologies if you're feeling a bit uncomfortable with the dissection. What we are doing here is we're actually retracting the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and we are revealing the insula. The insula is a lobe that is deep inside the brain, and it will actually surround the diencephalon. So we would actually have to do this separation of the lobes to be able to see the insula. Insula comes from the root word island, so it's a little island inside the brain. Talk about some of the functions of lobes. I'm not going to make you know every single function. What I'd like you to do is pick one or two for each lobe to have a general understanding what these lobes do. We're going to have, for the frontal lobe, it's going to play a very important role for initiating motion. So we have the planning of the motion. It's going to be in the premotor cortex. And the voluntary movement that forms is going to be initiated by the primary motor cortex. The Broca's area in the frontal lobe is going to be responsible for speech production. So this will help you take information and turn it into vocalization or sign language, depending on how you communicate. And so it'll help with that speech production. And it's also going to help with executive cognitive functions. So it's going to help us make judgments about our external environment and figure out what is the best response to those stimuli. And lastly, it will be important for the emotional response. Some of the structures in the frontal lobe are going to be part of the limbic system, and the limbic system plays an important role in creating memories, but also regulating emotion. So again, you don't have to know every single one of these, but I just want you to know one or two of them for this frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is going to have the somatosensory cortex, and this is where information is going to be first processed from our external and internal environment. We're going to be talking more about this when we get into ascending and descending pathways. The parietal lobe also tells us our spatial awareness of objects, sounds, and body parts. So it can really help us determine like a 3D map of our environment and be able to manipulate objects in our environment relative to each other. And the parietal lobe is going to contain the Wernicke's area. The W is pronounced with a V sound rather than the American W sound. So Wernicke's area. And so this is going to help us understand speech. The occipital lobe is going to be really important for processing vision. So our nerves are going to actually go from our eyes, and there's going to be a lot of synapsing that occurs, and all of that information is going to go to the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe is going to be responsible for processing hearing, smell, and object identification, and also be important for emotional responses and memory. So the parietal lobe is for somatosensory information, so it's like touch, proprioception, pressure, those sorts of things. The occipital lobe is dedicated for vision. The temporal lobe is dedicated for hearing and smell, in addition to these other functions. And the insula is dedicated to taste or gustation, which is like the fancy physiology term for it. In our next chapter, we're going to look at senses. So we're going to go on in our lecture to chapter 15. Chapter 14 will be reserved for lab. And so in chapter 15, we'll look at the special senses and the general senses and look at how they detect their stimuli and how they are processed by the central nervous system. I did want to go into a little bit of detail about the primary somatosensory cortex and the primary motor cortex. And so we're going to look at what is known as a homunculus. And homunculus means tiny human. What we'll see here and in the larger version of this image, that senses and motor responses are going to be regionally organized in these cortexes, and different regions are going to have different proportions of the brain dedicated to it. So here we're going to have the primary motor cortex, which is responsible for initiating motion, and the primary somatosensory cortex, which is going to feel general senses such as pressure, touch, vibration, pain, proprioception, all of those things. And the primary motor cortex is going to be part of the frontal lobe, which is going to be specifically in the precentral gyrus. And the primary somatosensory cortex is going to be part of the parietal lobe, and it's going to be in the postcentral gyrus. These are going to border the central sulcus that separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So what are we looking at here? What we're looking at here is we're looking at the regions of the brain that are associated with certain senses and certain motion. So if we go over to here on the primary somatosensory cortex side, we can see that this particular area of the primary somatosensory cortex is going to be responsible for detecting visceral structures, so things such as the intestine. Areas such as the tongue is going to be detected here, and we have like the lips, the face, the nose, eyes, the thumb, and the fingers and the hands. What I want you to notice here is that the primary somatosensory cortex, the areas that are dedicated to a particular sensation or a particular area is not proportional to body shape. Rather, certain areas are going to have more parts of the brain dedicated to that area. So especially if you can see here with our thumb and our finger and our hands, because we interact with our environment so much with our hands and our fingers, we need to be able to sense things very, very finely using our hands. The lips and the tongue are also other regions where the brain has a high proportion of communication or a high proportion of the brain dedicated to those regions. So maybe something like stuck on your tongue or stuck on your lips, you would feel it much more intensely than if it was on like the back of your arm. The same kind of disproportionate organization of the brain to the rest of the body can be seen here in the primary motor cortex. So the hand again is going to have a lot of different neurons going to it, and so this will allow us to have fine motor control of our hands. Our face and our lips as well, because we're going to have to be able to do fine expressions and be able to speak with our lips and our tongue and our teeth. So we'll talk about these regions a little bit more when we go into ascending and descending pathways. I just wanted you to have a general sense of what the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex actually does when we talk about those pathways. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. I will see you later. Bye.